I am heavy weapons guy. And this is my weapon. Cry some more.
People were pining for Relic's comeback to the Dawn of War series after they felt let down after Iron Lord's Soulstorm. Even more so with Relic showing expanding talents with the Company of Heroes series, with both their debut and expansion pack being a huge success, with another around the corner. But we didn't have to wait long. It was only 11 months after Soulstorm before fans got their hands on the anticipated Dawn of War 2, only for it ended up being a contentious return. Dawn of War 2 took the series in a different direction, much smaller in scale and leaning into a more nitty gritty tactics focused game rather than the bigger and more bombastic strategy games of the prior entries. Still, despite a lot of fans feeling alienated, Dawn of War 2 is still remembered fondly by most, so they must have done something right. Let's take a look. I'm assuming you've watched my other reviews so far. If not, if you played the games you should be fine. Luckily the game works out of the box, so no faffing around with fan patches on config tweaks, with one exception, the rain. The rain in this game is excessive, you might say. I can only show screenshots since if I show footage of it, I'd be committing bitrate genocide. Unfortunately, there's no way of turning it down, so I recommend just turning it off completely, which you can't do in the game. This is the one thing you need to go into a config file to change. I'll talk more about the rain later, but for now, you're all set. Forgot to mention, this game also used Game for Windows Live back in the day. If you don't know what that is, consider yourself lucky. Thankfully, it was removed in 2014, along with switching the servers from GameSpy, that shut down, to using Steam services, meaning that online is still playable today. Anyway, onto the game. Dawn of War 2 takes place some time after Soulstorm in a subsector known as Aurelia, which consists of a few planets. These are both the homes of the Blood Ravens and also their recruiting worlds, something they had to fall back on as apparently the Waaagh campaign in Soulstorm ended in an absolute disaster for the spacemarines, with them losing over half their chapter. How the fuck did you manage that? It almost feels like a dig at the game itself, which feels unfair, considering Iron Lord got screwed over by publisher nonsense. In fact, since we're talking about prior games, let's touch base on all the games up until this point since the series canon isn't always clear. Dawn of War has one ending, so that's straightforward. Winter Assault has the Eldar ending canon. Dark Crusade has a Space Marine victory along with them facing off and defeating the Imperial Guard on Kronos. And the Waaagh campaign in Soulstorm, as mentioned, ends with a crippling defeat for the Blood Ravens. Jumping ahead a bit, but it is confirmed in Dawn of War 3 that this was an ARC victory for those wondering. Now that we're all up to speed, it should make things easier. Starting the game you pick your difficulty, which I'll get into later, and a name for your commander, who is effectively you for all intents and purposes. The opening mission acts as a tutorial to get you adjusted to the basics, teaching you camera control, the cover system, and how to use abilities. It's a more straightforward introduction since the game lacks the more broader mechanics that a typical RTS would normally have. Things here are more concise. Your mission is to assist Captain Thule, the Force Commander from Dark Crusade, and to drive the Orcs from the area. Thule however isn't very helpful as he's facing the wrong direction and not actually shooting anything. This bug has been in the game for a long while and actually makes this segment harder than it should be. Really wish they fixed this. The next few missions introduce more squads and mechanics, so it isn't long before you get acclimated to the game. As mentioned, the game leans more into tactics rather than strategy, but what do I mean by this? It's easy for me to throw out terminology, but let me lay out what I mean. A strategy game, specifically a real-time strategy game, has certain attributes that make up the genre. One of the biggest aspects of RTS games is resource management, not only acquiring it, even through areas on the map or your own structures, but along with your expenditure, making good spending decisions. Map control is also an important factor. It's not always about holding a choke point, but also areas that may offer resources or just plain old real estate to build a base. Base building is the core of RTS games, to establish map control with, generate resources, or to build the buildings needed to produce your army with. Which brings us on to unit production, your way of imposing your will and your skills onto your opponent and to achieve victory. All of this creates a more macro management focused game, emphasis on the bigger picture rather than individual battles. A tactics game in comparison takes a much different approach, and yes, Total War battles are real-time tactics, not strategy. You have a much greater focus on individual units with their strengths and weaknesses, along with utilising their abilities, both actives and passives. Positioning also plays a very important role, either directional with the use of flanking, or environmental with the use of cover and terrain. We also tend to forgo base building and unit production here, with the genre focused on making good use of the limited units that you do have. Since we don't have base building and unit production, resource management takes a back seat, with it maybe playing a minor role for your abilities. All of this creates a more micro heavy game, constantly moving units, using abilities, avoiding hazards, a focus on individual fights rather than the bigger picture. Now these aren't hard lines in the sand in terms of genres, you have to see some overlap and crossover. Company of Heroes is a good example of Relic leaning more into tactical gameplay with a cover system and flanking, but with it still having RTS elements. Dawn of War 2 interestingly does both, with the campaign being just a real-time tactics game having no base building, unit production or resource management, but with skirmish and multiplayer bringing back some of those real-time strategy mechanics the campaign lacks. Now I know all this was a bit of a spiel on genres that probably went on a bit too long, but I think categorising the game properly helps in the long run, giving it a fair assessment on what it does well, but also recognising where a lot of the fan base's grievances come from. Right, let's finally talk about the gameplay now. Dawn of War 2 still plays like an RTS on the face of it, but feels completely different contextually. Rather than building the base and producing units, you instead focus on getting the most out of each individual unit, trying to preserve them and using their skills to the fullest potential. A big way to preserve units is the use of the cover system. Rather than having units standing around in the open and shooting, you know how to use cover in the environments to protect units from range fire, with units automatically adjusting themselves into a firing position. It adds a lot of depth to the moment-to-moment decision making, not only positioning your units correctly and getting a good line of sight on your enemies, but also reacting quickly to incoming hazards, such as a grenade being hurled at your devastators. This is one of many mechanics that have come over from Company of Heroes, and it does honestly feel a little odd seeing spacemarines and even orcs hiding behind some loose rocks to avoid damage. Now I am going to have a bit of a whinge about the game to get it out of the way. The first issue is something that I think is a byproduct of the cover system, and that's the micro adjusting units do, either to get into cover or just for the aesthetics of moving around in a firefight. It leads to things sometimes feeling a little finicky, with your units fidgeting around like an ADHD kid who hasn't taken his prescribed Adderall. It causes issues like units breaking line of sight with their enemies, interruptions of their firing, particularly a problem with flamers and rocket launchers, and the fact that they can ironically run into danger such as grenades when trying to move into cover. Adding fuel to the fire is another mechanic brought in from Company of Heroes, and that's the inconsistent firing. Instead of doing a fairly consistent damage output like in Dawn of War 1, here you have more erratic damage output, which can lead to situations where you can have this one unit that refuses to die because everyone is missing their shots. It's really annoying watching Space Marines missing someone stood right in front of them. All this leads to units feeling unreliable and undependable at times, combined with some obligatory jank with the AI being fucking stupid at times. It can be quite aggravating when you're trying to make a tactical choice or put in a position and needing to make a quick snap decision, only for you to lose a unit or miss an opening through no fault of your own. Now to be fair, this only happens some of the time and it's usually something minor, but it's enough to comment on. Let me put it this way. It's like if you play Total War and a unit will randomly drop an order. Wait, that does happen in Total War. It's like if you play Total War and a unit you told to fire at an enemy instead charges out of formation. Wait, that happens in Total War as well. It's like if you play Total War and you set up a ranged unit in an advantageous position to fire at will, but instead they just sit there not firing. Okay, fuck this analogy. My main point is that it can feel very frustrating when units just aren't doing what you want some of the time due to a blip in their AI. A lot of this is due to them building off Company of Heroes, which lead the mechanics of that game being brought into this one, which these mechanics are finding come due to it being slower paced and leading into realism with a World War II setting. but here with Dawn of War's more aggressive pacing and needing to make snap decisions, it can be irritating at times. Now again, to be clear, these issues only happen some of the time, and much like Total War, it doesn't ruin the overall experience, but it is a negative for the game. Two more little irritations. One is Sinkhole locking units in an animation, leaving them vulnerable and unable to move or use abilities. Second is knockbacks. It's mostly some units that are a problem, the Eldar Seer Council in particular, stun locking you with repeated knockback after knockback, giving me flashbacks to Warframe. So that's enough whinging, let's talk about some positives, since the game does overall play very well. We still retain the range and melee combat from the first game, working well in conjunction with the new tactics focused gameplay. I've already mentioned the cover system, but it works surprisingly well with the melee system, balancing cover based range combat with aggressive melee brawls. We also have destructible environments. Cover can be destroyed in a variety of ways, leaving units exposed, which keeps the game dynamic. Either repositioning your units into new cover, or capitalising on your enemy who are now caught with their pants down. Another form of cover are buildings that can be garrisoned, giving units a defensive bonus. Although I honestly don't use this mechanic much, you might as well hold up a sign saying, "Grenade me please." Even in a scenario that sounds like it would be ideal, such as a heavy weapons team using a building with a great view of the area, the team have to pack up and set up every time they change a window, meaning they're spending more time dicking around than actually firing a hail of death at your enemies. Speaking of firing a hail of death, let's finally talk about one of the biggest mechanics brought to Dawn of War 2, and that is the suppression mechanic. Again, coming from Company of Heroes, where it was used to simulate soldiers taking cover when getting sprayed with an MG42. Suppressed units will slow down and get afflicted with massive combat penalties, making them vulnerable for grenades and melee units. It's effectively a way to control the battlefield, since even if you're outnumbered, one heavy gunner can lock down an entire area, if not just shred the enemy to pieces themselves. Suppression effectively replaces the morale mechanic from the first game, and integrates well with the cover system, giving you an opportunity to preserve your units under fire. Now you have a few ways to break suppression, eliminating whoever is doing the suppressing, some abilities that rallies units, or just a good old fashioned act of running away. Yeah, retreating is a mechanic, thematically a bit weird and is a bit flat on a mechanical level. You press a button and units will begin retreating, gaining a speed and defensive buff, and will automatically fall back to the nearest reinforcement point. It's your way of dipping from a fight and cutting your losses. It's kinda one dimensional, useful mind you, but I do feel like it's a get out jail free card that doesn't really come with many consequences outside of a bit of time wasting. So yeah, that's pretty much most of the gameplay for Dawn of War 2. There's still bits and bobs to cover in the campaign, but now let's talk about skirmish and online since it retains some RTS elements. No base building though, only upgrading your HQ, which is really disappointing when even Comp had some base building. The only building you can do are defensive structures that annoyingly cost population, and power generators around power points to boost their output. Yes, power now comes from strategic points that can be fortified with a defensive upgrade, preventing capture like a listening post, and the aforementioned generators. You also get requisition from other points, but these can't be upgraded with anything, no defensive options or ways to boost their output. You don't even get any research options for the long run, it's a really simple system. We also have a very restrictive population cap, which I think was a big thing that irked people back in the day. You really can't build a big army like you can in Dawn of War 1, and the caps aren't even separated by infantry and vehicles anymore. So instead of the big battles from previous games, you get something more like a large skirmish. You can get some pretty decent battles when upping the amount of players and maybe the resources, but it is overall much smaller in scale. Not only is it small in scale, but the skirmish options offered up by Dawn of War 2 in terms of maps and setting is way more limited. We're even down to 6 max players from the 8 we had. And all maps have this symmetrical design to them that makes the game feel competitively balanced, trading off the more enjoyable and unique maps for a more standardised set. It really does limit the fun scenarios you can make from the first game and leaves skirmish feeling a little bland honestly. Something that does spice things up are your commanders. You get a selection of 3 per race, not only granting you a unique commander unit, but also their skills and different faction abilities. They usually come in a choice of 3 roles: offensive, defensive, and some form of utility. They do offer some good change ups even when playing as the same race. Speaking of, let's talk about the races. We have 4 races to pick from: Space Marines, Orcs, Eldar, and a new race at Dawn of War, the Tyranids. The Tyranids are a swarm faction, similar roles to the Orcs but much greater in numbers, and have more options for stealthy ambushes or quick hit and runs. The returning races are similar to their appearance in the first game. Space Marines are an all-rounder, Eldar are a glass cannon, and the Orcs are a melee swarm, although come with a few more range options to prevent redundancy with the Tyranids. So I think that covers the big parts of the gameplay. It's a big shift from Dawn of War's one more bigger, aggressive strategy focused to something more slower, smaller, and more tactical focused. There's still more to talk about with the campaign, but for now, let's shift gears and talk about the presentation. You can probably already tell that this game is a big step up from the first, with the use of a new engine that brought improved lighting and shadows, advanced shader effects, and normal mapping for textures. It looked great for the time, and honestly, I think it still holds up quite well for a game that's nearly 20 years old. Nowadays you can just crank everything to max and run it no problems, although an FPS cap might be worth considering. Since the game has shifted to a smaller scale tactics game, there's a focus on fidelity and individual details. For example, the bullet traces and impacts look incredible. One complaint I do have though is a lack of persistent bodies, since they opted in favour of ragdolls that can also glitch out, and so they get called out fairly quickly, as opposed to the first game that gave you the option of having persistent bodies that would literally last for the whole game. A highlight for the game are the environments. Not only do they look great, but we also got some variety here from the different planets the game offers. Calderas offers a sandy desert with rocky canyons, with the population still living in shelters and shanties. Typhon gives players dense jungles and swamplands with the occasional forgotten ruins. And Meridian, my favourite, being a hive city, the home of billions, coming with an urban industrial look. These environments then get even more variations through the Tyranid infestation that modifies the maps and surroundings, along with variety with the time of day and weather effects, assuming you keep them turned on. Let's talk about the rain effects, because holy fuck did they go overboard here. I really can't show any footage of it since, as mentioned before, the bitrate will just get nuked. I'm not sure if the game was like this when it originally released, or it's an issue with the game scaling up to modern hardware. Let's run through the issues. Ow, my eyes hurt, this is painful to look at, ow my fucking eyes. It makes things hard to see since there's so much obstruction and the high opacity of the rain doesn't help things. You can easily lose your white cursor in the midst of all this white rain. It reminds me of losing your cursor in Bloons Tower Defense 6, but there it's because you're committing 300 war crimes a second, while here it's just because of the rain. As mentioned, you can't turn it down or off in game, you have to go into a config to do it. A self-indulgent point here, the rain effects absolutely ballooned up the file sizes on my drive. I just stopped recording on rain missions before I found out I could turn it off. As of writing, I'm still waiting on storage prices to drop. It's a shame since I do like some good old rain, it gives a great atmosphere and it's a shame I have to turn it off. Oh well, has to be done. You talked about the visuals, now let's talk about the audio. Again, another big step up from the first game. Dawn of War 1's sound effects were okay, a few standouts but mostly sits in the category of does the job. Dawn of War 2 is really a cut above, the game sounds amazing. Everything has much more weight and impact, the bolters in particular, which they finally fixed. They've gone from this generic pea shooter to sounding like cannons. The heavy bolters take it even further with these weighty, bassy automatic fire screaming death at your enemies, along with the focus fire ability turning up even more, making it one of my favourite sounds in the game. And finally the Dreadnought's autocannon that goes music to my ears. Speaking of music, the soundtrack here is again incredible. Dawn of War 1 already had an amazing OST, something I still enjoy to this day, but the second game is just as great, maybe even better. Two of the tracks, the Space Marines and Eldar themes, are genuinely amazing, part of some of the playlists I listen to. The Space Marines theme has this calm but strong chant invoking a sense of duty, while the Eldar's theme sounds like a choir of war cries. Even the way the music is used is improved from the first game. As opposed to just hitting play and letting the track go, the game now has dynamic music which changes intensity depending on what's happening. So if you're just moving between a fight, it's calm and reserved. However, if you end up in a huge skirmish, the music will now intensify with the on-screen combat. It's such a great addition. Since we're talking about the dynamic music, they also added some dynamicism, which isn't a word apparently, to the dialogue. Voice lines are now contextual, with units calling out specific enemies and scenarios, such as an enemy going for cover or a grenade being thrown your way. It reminds me of the replica from Fear. The tone and delivery of these lines can even change depending on how well they're doing. If you're getting your ass handed to you, your units sound more panicky and desperate. And since we're talking about voice lines, the voice acting is S tier. Again, Dawn of War 1 was already way up there. This game may be better due to having variety for more different characters having important roles in the campaign. You get a much more down to earth dialogue with the Space Marines here, discussing the ongoing plot and events. Almost sounded like a frank, informal workplace discussion with the lads spoken just out of earshot of your bosses. It's a different direction from the more grandiose, well-spoken, formal demeanour, discussing high-level topics like in the first game, almost mirroring the shift from a macro strategy game to a more micro tactics game. That's not to say they've watered down or dumbed down the dialogue, it still oozes with that Warhammer 40k spirit, with lines of dialogue having more lines between them. It's just conveyed in a different way. I also think the delivery of the dialogue is better here, using these looping animated videos of the characters yapping. It's a really simple but effective way of having the characters talking, which some people may say looks cheap, which yeah, maybe, but I think it's better than relying on the in-game cinematics like in the first game, that ended up looking awkward and janky, which I think have aged much worse. Dawn of War 2 does have the occasional in-game scene and yeah. If there is one more nitpick I have, it's the animations. The in-game cutscenes are weak, but even elsewhere they're lacking. The big one for me are sync kills, actually a bit of a downgrade from the first game. And I'm not sure if it's just a case of there being less units to trigger one, or they did cut back here. Only really catch a glimpse of one in the midst of a scrap, rather than a gory performance of squeezing blood from an enemy and throwing them across the map. I don't know, maybe I'm just not noticing them. So overall on the presentation, top scores all around, genuinely great for the time and aged fairly well in my opinion. Some little nitpicks here and there, but they really are minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. So let's move on to the campaign. The campaign here is almost like a hybrid of the two different types we got from the Dawn of War games. There's a strong narrative through line with structured events and missions, but also has sandbox elements such as optional less structured missions and a level up on war gear system to allow different methods of play. Let's talk difficulty first, since the Dawn of War series can never seem to get it right. Difficulty increases enemy damage. I'll put the values on screen and maybe you can spot the problem. The jump from Sergeant to Captain, normal and hard respectively, is massive with a 3 times increase to the enemy's damage, making Captain significantly harder than Sergeant, and weirdly having Primarch only being a minor bump up. It also creates another problem, since the enemy damage is so high on harder difficulties, melee units end up sucking and underperforming, since they struggle to close distances and have no protection from ranged units while in melee, melting in seconds to enemy fire. The difficulties kind of split the game in half, giving you 2 very different experiences. The 2 easier difficulties give you more room for experimentation and playing around with loadouts and weapons, while the 2 harder modes feel more punishing and stricter, less experimentation and more sweaty, but gives you a good challenge and encourages you to think about your builds. Now I did 2 runs of the game, one on Captain where I took the game seriously, or one on Sergeant where I experimented with character skills and loadouts, and honestly, while I do normally recommend harder difficulties in games, I actually recommend Sergeant. The harder difficulties can feel a bit too bullshit with the gameplay issues I mentioned earlier, and the fact that melee units underperform, along with the possibility of tanking your playthrough due to bad leveling of your squads. The easier modes, while a little bit too forgiving, I think are more enjoyable since you can actually play the game without worrying about metagaming too much. Ultimately though, the choice is yours. Something you don't have much choice in though is the difficulty curve. This game's balancing throughout the campaign is rough. The game starts out easy, maybe a bit too easy, but starts ramping up quickly. The difficulty spikes fairly high in the mid game, and it's not unusual to get a bit of a beating and have to resort to some cheesing. But then the game starts getting easier as you get some good equipment and skills, and from there you start to snowball until the end. So while the prior games focus on strategy and this game's skirmish being a mix of strategy and tactics, The campaign is straight real-time tactics. Usually you find yourself in command of only 4 squads who have their own role and can be customized between missions. Let's run through them. First we have your Force Commander. Yeah, technically not a squad, but he is your leader, and he's present in all missions. You can't swap him out like the others. He's similar to the Force Commander in the first game, a single hero unit that can lead the charge, capable in melee and can have a few abilities to buff your army, or squads in this case. Next we have Tarkus, the leader of a tactical squad. Your basic range unit but comes with tons of utility, being great with grenades and other throwables, along with being able to use specialised weapons such as flamers and plasma weapons. Overall, a solid reliable unit. I always find myself bringing Tarkus with me since the utility he has allows me to min-max the other squads, the dependable backbone of my roster. Now we have Avatars, the heavy weapons team. A cumbersome range squad that early on is your way of suppressing your enemy and dishing out huge damage. Later on you can spec him out to be more anti-armor, when he decides to fire. Avatars is another I usually take. Being able to suppress your enemy and lay down effectively a safe area for your units is incredibly useful. Cyrus leads a squad of scouts, focusing on stealth and recon. Doesn't seem useful at first, I especially overlooked him for the longest time, but when you realise how powerful his cloaking ability is when upgraded, you realise he's probably the most broken character in the game. He can basically solo some missions with the right loadout, or just be incredibly useful with the rest of his team. Cyrus usually makes up the 4 squad I take on harder difficulties, but it's a bit too cheesy for easier modes. For lower difficulties I usually take Thaddeus, the melee jetpack squad, who used to jump straight into a fight, far more aggressive than they were in Dawn of War 1. There, jetpack troopers used to look like they were dropping in for a cup of tea, now they drop in like they're crashing the party. Unfortunately, he really underperforms on harder difficulties due to the high enemy damage, so he's usually my 4th squad on normal to balance out the roster with 2 range and 2 melee. Now there is one more unit that gets introduced later in the game, but I'll talk about it in the spoiler segment. Now while each character does have an ideal role and purpose, there is room to change things up, something I did on my normal mode run. I turned Tarkus into a melee unit, acting as bodyguards for my commander, which proved to be pretty useful with him soaking up damage well. I also tried to range Thaddeus. My thinking was dropping in behind the enemy lines and shooting them in their exposed rear, but didn't really prove to be very effective. Lastly, I did a heavy gunner commander, copying Captain Thule, and this was surprisingly useful with Avatars since you can have 2 different heavy weapons out in the field at once. While these are interesting ways to experiment with your character, I just think it's better to build into their strengths, especially since there's no respecking option. So I think that brings us on to the leveling system. Every time you level up you get 2 points to put into 4 stats. Stamina, which is your health and tankiness, range, self-explanatory, strength, which is your melee skills, and will, your energy used for abilities. Every few points you put into a stat you unlock a passive ability for your squad. These can be really useful, and can make you think about maybe investing some points in a stat line for a particular passive that you wouldn't have otherwise. I do have 2 issues with the leveling system though. One is level scaling. I never liked this system in any game. Like what's the point in leveling up if the enemies are just gonna level up with you? It's much less egregious here compared to some games, but that's because it's a really superfluous mechanic. It would have been better if the game just gave each character a skill point every now and then at the end of certain missions instead of leveling up, because it causes the second problem I have. If you don't use the character, like I didn't use Thaddeus on Captain difficulty, they can fall behind in levels, meaning a character you may have neglected now becoming even more undesirable to use, creating a negative feedback loop. One of the ways of leveling up outside of killing enemies is the bonus at the end of a mission. The better you do, the more XP you get. You're graded in 3 areas. Fury, which is the amount of enemies killed. Resilience, determined by how many of your squads that didn't get downed in the mission. And finally, Speed, grading you on your speed. If you get enough points, you can gain additional deployments for the day, which affects your end of campaign score and allows you to more easily react to time limited defense missions where you defend a strategic asset. These assets can be found by the player during most missions where you have the option of capturing one, and only one. The game doesn't let you take more than one in a mission. There are 3 types of assets. The automated foundry, increasing the amount of turrets you can call in. along with giving you a boost at the end of a mission which makes earning extra deployments easier. Communication arrays, giving you more artillery to use and providing intel during briefings, allowing you to better prepare for a mission. And finally, shrines, that grant more uses of the bubble shield, that's what I'm calling it, bonus XP at the end of missions, and slowing the Tyranid infestation rate. They're obviously worth getting since they're usually a minor detour, and while you do have to occasionally defend them, these missions are a great way to get more XP and war gear. Speaking of, let's talk about war gear. Equipment can drop randomly from enemies and as rewards for missions. You also have different equipment for certain roles, anti-armor for example, along with gear with special traits attached, but some war gear is simply a straight upgrade since they also abide by the level up system. Gear that you don't want can be donated in exchange for XP, and you're going to be doing that a lot. It's an alright system, 2 complaints. One is the inability to transmute or recraft existing war gear. There are times where you've equipped, say a rocket launcher for anti-armor, but not get another one for a while, even though you can be drowning in heavy bolters that you just end up donating. It can be frustrating when you're collecting all this useless shit and all you want is one type of weapon. 2. Some armor and accessories are locked to certain characters. Why? I understand for Cyrus since he's a scout, but for the other characters, it seems like an oversight when the game gives you the option of switching out their role. It's an unnecessary restriction. Well, let's talk about the missions themselves because they could be improved. The more structured and narrative missions are fine, could have done more, but it's not the biggest issue. My main gripe are the assassinate missions. You're going to do these a lot and they're the most uninteresting. Go to target, kill target, mission complete. These assassinates are basically a boss fight. Weird thing for what was previously an RTS series, and they're not the best to play. Bosses are basically huge bullet sponges and range from being a little tedious but tolerable to being bullshit. The ones on the better end usually have some form of ability, triggering a large but delayed AoE, which forces you to move units out of danger. This works well since it leans into the whole tactics element of the game, having you reposition units and keeping you alert for hazards. On the other side though, you get some boss fights that just one-shot your units. Very little time, if any, to react. Not enjoyable at all to fight, and can be frustrating when you lose some of your end of mission bonus because of bullshit like this. I usually end up cheesing these fights. Oh, and of course, it's the Eldar who are the most guilty of this, with some of the worst boss fights in the game. The Orcs and Tyranids are more enjoyable for the most part. One massive missed opportunity with the boss fights is the fact that not a single boss makes use of direction or cover. Yeah, you would think that maybe having a boss that's weak to getting shot in an exposed area would make so much sense, but no. Not even the vehicle bosses, which is even weirder since there's literally a directional mechanic for vehicles where you do more damage in the flanks or rear. Why not use this here? Now you do get some variations for the more generic missions, a weaker assassinate target in exchange for destroying a base as well, and they do change things up since you now have to bring equipment to deal with the structures and respawning enemies. These missions only show up later in the game, which is odd, since having some of these missions earlier would have been welcome. As I'll mention, early in the campaign needed some more going on. Now let's move on to the world map. It's a fair bit different than what they did in Dark Crusade and Soulstorm. It's not a sandbox campaign where you capture territory and manage your army. It's used more as an interface to select missions. There really aren't many mechanics here. As mentioned before, you do have some time limited missions that need consideration so you don't miss your opportunity, but in general, the world map here is really static. One feature here is the Tyranid infestation. Each planet will slowly accrue this infestation over time, which basically does nothing other than visuals, I think. The only thing this actually does gameplay wise is affect your end of campaign score. Really seems like a missed opportunity not to have more here. Maybe having more infestation could trigger more stronger units to spawn, or have them show up in a non-Tyranid mission as a third party. One interesting direction they take is the multiple directions you can take in the campaign. After a certain point, you get given 3 campaign objectives, and gives you the option of tackling them in whatever order you would like. Do the prime gene samples first, trust me. The last mechanic that the campaign has is the strategic assets you can capture I mentioned earlier. The campaign mechanics are okay, but a bit underwhelming. They definitely could have done more here. The pacing of the campaign also needed some work because, man, it really drags early on with a lot of generic and hand-holding missions back to back. Along with the game being very frugal with equipment variety, you get stuck with the basic weapons for too long. It starts picking up in the midpoint of the game, but it's a good few hours of playing before that. On your first run, it's probably not bad, but on repeat runs and returning to the game, yeah, I wish I could skip some of this. Last thing to cover is co-op. Yeah, the whole campaign is playable co-op. I have played it in the past with a mate, but it's been a while so I'm going off memory a bit. The host controls a force commander and one squad while the other person controls two. It makes the game much easier since even with poor communication skills, you're micromanaging 2 units instead of 4. So that wraps up the gameplay I wanted to cover. Let's finally talk about the story. The first order of business is dealing with the Orc invasion on Calderas, an important recruiting role for the Blood Ravens, even more important now since they lost nearly half the chapter in the Caravar campaign. Captain Thule is leading the defence and wants to know what's stirring up the Orcs, as they're clearly being directed by something. The next 3 missions have you taking out Orc war bosses to try and slow the green tide. However, during one mission of you fending off an Orc attack, you end up bumping into the Eldar. It seems like the Eldar were the ones agitating the Orcs, although in this instance, it seems to have backfired as whatever agreement they had broke down. So now the Blood Ravens are in a difficult spot. Not only are they dealing with an Orc threat, but the Eldar are also here running rampant on their operations. What are the Eldar up to? Well, it seems like they're trying to strengthen the Orcs to prepare for some incoming threat that the Space Marines are unaware of. This threat soon makes itself known, as during a night defense of a settlement, both you and the Orcs get attacked by the Tyranids, their first appearance at Dawn of War. During the Tyranid onslaught however, Captain Thule becomes mortally wounded. This cutscene also bugged out for me, guess they never really fixed this issue. After rescuing Thule, he's put into status as not only are his organs damaged, but a poison is also attacking his system. This is where the Dawn of War 2 demo originally ends, so I consider everything past here to be spoiler territory. If you want to skip, go to here. After dealing with some more Eldar raiders, Gabriel Angelos of all people contacts you after learning of the situation in Aurelia and Thule's condition. Angelos is now en route to the system but is weeks away. As such, he now acts as your advisor, giving you mission briefings and sending you the occasional transmission. The first task he gives you is an important one: Vengeance. Your target is the warrior beast that incapacitated Thule. After dealing with the beast, this is where the campaign opens up with 3 paths for 3 objectives. Objective 1, securing prime gene samples to develop a genetic poison against the Tyranids. Again, this is the one I recommend doing first. Objective 2, secure Angel Forge as it has the capabilities to produce the warheads needed to deliver the toxins. I recommend this second. And the third objective, locate the astronomical array on Typhon, as this array is the only one that can detect a weakness on the Tyranid High Fleet. Going ahead and securing the prime gene samples, you then need to secure a sample of the biotoxin to complete the genetic poison. This biotoxin will also allow the ability to cure the poison currently afflicting Captain Thule. The sample is sent back to the ship mid-mission, but you need to find your own way to extraction, only for you to get ambushed by a very strong Hive Tyrant. However, the biotoxin you sent back to the ship was quickly put to work curing Thule, and he drops in to save the day, encased in the iconic Dreadnought armour. Yeah, this is why I recommend doing this campaign objective first. You unlock the Dreadnought as your 6th selectable squad, and he's probably one of the best. You can spec him for either range or melee, and even on harder difficulties. His melee build is still viable since he's so tanky, although he can still melt in some situations. The only downside is he needs repair kits to keep his health topped up, as he can't recover from reinforcement points or other abilities like the rest of the roster. So you have to make special considerations and sacrifice an accessory slot if you plan on bringing Thule with you. Although I've seen him regen health randomly, I don't know. I also want to briefly bring up the Waaagh system again because on my first run for this review, the assault cannon for the Dreadnought straight up never dropped. I even tried farming and I never got it. Really wish I could have transmuted some of that Dreadnought armor that kept fucking dropping. This meant I was stuck with melee through on hard mode, and while he can tank a bit like I mentioned before, I was going range heavy with my roster, so I ended up not using him much. Anyway, the next objective is Angel Forge on Meridian, and upon arriving you have to deal with the greatest threat the Blood Ravens have encountered yet: bureaucracy. Normally, access to Angel Forge requires years of advance notice, but Administrator DeRosa offers a compromise. Deal with some Eldar raiding parties attacking their infrastructure, and they may offer some limited access to Angel Forge. Why the fuck are we negotiating this for? Just commandeer it. Thaddeus chimes in, stating this is typical behaviour from the governor of this planet, as this was his homeworld, growing up in the poor Undercity. A big question on everyone's mind though is a Tyranid threat. Meridian is home to billions, and so the Tyranids here must be causing havoc. Nope. Apparently, there aren't any signs of Tyranids here whatsoever. Nothing. Cyrus disputes this, as a Tyranid hive fleet wouldn't in a million millennia just skip over a planet. After dealing with the Eldar raiding parties, turns out they were also interfering with the scans of the planet, meaning the ability to detect the Tyranid infestation was compromised. Turns out, as Cyrus insisted, there are lots of Tyranids on Meridian, originally taking a stealthy approach, but are now launching serious attacks throughout the planet, which brings us on to the defense of Angel Gate. Angel Gate is an important part of Angel Forge's defensive wall and needs to be secured. Not only are the Tyranids attacking, but so are the Orcs looters raiding the interiors. The mission involves supporting the Imperial Guard, their first appearance in the game, along with reactivating generators for Angel Gate's defences, before ending with a holdout where you need to recapture the gatehouse in order to close the gate while fending off the Tyranids. Bit of a design flaw this. This mission is simultaneously a highlight of the game for me, and also a complete ball ache on harder difficulties. I legit had to go and get better equipment before tackling this on Captain difficulty, since I was doing this campaign objective first on that run. Big mistake. I don't have any footage of this mission on hard since it's a rain mission and I hadn't learned about the config tweak until after, so I didn't record it, but it's really unforgiving on harder difficulties. Oh yeah, it's around here we find out Aratus really doesn't like the Imperial Guard. The events on Kronos with the Space Marines and Imperial Guard infighting had a big impact on him, manifesting into a grudge against them. There are a lot of little things like this, aspects about a character that you can sometimes tie back to the older games. It really fleshes them out as more than just characters for this game, but characters that had history within the Blood Ravens with events we've played in the prior games. It's a neat touch. So to cut a long story short, the governor and his inner circle decided to bail and run away. Turns out he's hoarding some old Blood Ravens artifacts, including Terminator armour. That's our job. After defeating the Eldar and securing Angel Forge, you get to keep the Terminator armour and unlocking it to drop from now on as your reward for this campaign objective. Terminator armour is great, it completely changes how you play with your squads. You no longer use cover and gain access to powerful weapons. I ended up going with the Terminator loadout for Tarkas and Avatars, along with throwing a spare onto Thaddeus, and they were monstrous. They were super tanky and dished out tons of damage, super fun to use and experiment with when you unlock them. Onto the third campaign objective, we have the astronomical array to secure. This one is far more simple. It involves taking out some Orc war bosses to find its location, turning it on, and that's pretty much it. There's not much here honestly, and it also gives the worst reward, the ability to call in your own drop pod that acts as a reinforcement point. Not useless mind you, but compared to a Dreadnought and Terminator armour, it is a bit limp. Definitely feels like this objective was done last and the devs ran out of time. Anyway, let's get on to the finale. With all the objectives done, we are ready to strike the enemy's weakness. However, one last issue arises. The Tyranid hive mind has psychically attacked the navigators on Gabriel Angelos' ship, which means now it's unlikely for him to arrive. Basically, we're on our own. The final mission takes place on Typhon, where a feeder tendril from the Tyranid hive fleet has dug into the planet. The perfect weak spot for the toxic warhead. It's all in, your ships are battling the Tyranid fleet in orbit and providing support, along with Imperial Guard regiments being deployed. It's a last ditch effort to beat the Tyranids. As you're injecting the toxic warhead, your ship in orbit can't hold off the Tyranids fleet and gets taken down, but they emergency drop your remaining two squads in before crashing on the planet, meaning you have all 6 squads for the finale. The toxic warhead works, spelling death for the Tyranids Hive Fleet, but with none of your ships remaining, you have no way of escaping. You and the Imperial Guard make a heroic last stand to take as many of the Tyranids down with you. During the last stand, and as you're about to be overwhelmed, Gabriel Angelus comes in clutch and saves the day. By some miracle, despite the Tyranids' disruption, Gabriel manages to make it just in time, dropping himself and his company into the fight. He joins your roster to make one last charge against the last threat of the Tyranids, a hive mind tyrant who's still coordinating the remaining Tyranids. Gabriel makes no hesitation in confronting the beast. Yeah, embarrassingly, I almost failed this final fight. Anyway, defeat the creature, victory is achieved, and the game ends with a post score screen grading you on how well you did in the campaign. You do get a new save created that is effectively a sandbox mode, where you can continue to play if you so wish. So that's the story wrapped up. They did a really good job here. We got a few mini stories that weaves together into the greater narrative, a bit more going on than the more straightforward story of Dawn of War 1. I think a massive improvement from the first game are the characters. Not that they were bad before, but Dawn of War 2 not only introduces more characters but also fleshes out each one, with their own distinct perspectives on what a space marine is, history and background, along with different values and beliefs, giving the armoured superhumans much more depth than they usually get. One thing that really helps with fleshing out the characters is the amount of dialogue. There's a lot here. Most of the dialogue is delivered during intermissions between levels, and there's even different dialogue depending on the order you complete the campaign objectives, a very nice touch. Now, one complaint I had for Dawn of War 1 was the fact we only played as the Space Marines and didn't get a chance to try the other races. I surprisingly don't have the same complaint for this game. Dawn of War's 2 campaign is a completely different beast. I think including playable missions of the other factions would just distract from the campaign, especially with the leveling up on war gear systems, although this idea gets explored in a later expansion. Well, that's the game. Unfortunately, there's a lot less to talk about with mod support. Not that there's no mod support at all, but certainly not the bustling modern scene that was present from the first game, one that is still active. Most mods here are rebalances and cosmetic, not much here that adds new content or bring in overhauls. Relic didn't release an STK with Dawn of War 2, and the new engine was much harder to work with for modders. Bit of a shame really. The army painter is also a downgrade. More of a sidestep. We lost the full colour picker, which... why? We've got 2 different materials to pick from and multiple patterns for the Space Marines. You can still import in custom badges, but no banners. They added and taketh away, just a lot of compromises. I'm also not a big fan of how limited the skirmish options are. It really feels like they were trying to appeal to the competitive RTS scene and removed anything that didn't fit into that archetype. I never find myself booting this up just to play a few games, while I do find myself launching the first game every now and then for some skirmish matches, especially with mods. Anyway, do I recommend Dawn of War 2? Yes, with an asterisk. I think it's a great game that achieves what it set out to do. It's what it set out to do that can be an issue. If you go into the game expecting an RTS, which is a reasonable thing to do, you may feel let down here, particularly with the campaign. I think everyone who wanted a sequel to the first game wanted something bigger and better, a game that scaled things up rather than scaled down, especially with the Warhammer 40k universe. Next time we'll be covering the 2 expansions for Dawn of War 2, Chaos Rising and Retribution. That's all for now, I'll see you again.